Hello and welcome to Zero to Traction, a podcast about how first-time founders create companies that scale. I'm one of your regular co-hosts, Josh David Miller, aka JDM, and I'm here with my other regular co-host, Cameron Law. No adjective today. Cameron, how are you?
Dang, I was, you beat me to the punch on that. I was gonna say, oh, no big, fancy word here, but, nonetheless, it's good to be back in the studio with you and looking forward to having a great dialogue to support founders in growing and scaling.
Well, speaking of being in the studio and fancy words, this is our antepenultimate episode before we have our live in-person session at GEW. We will talk about that toward the end of the show. But how can I miss the opportunity to drop antepenultimate into the sentence here, into the conversation? So
We'll have to
today we're
throw
going to
that
talk about
into the show notes.
it. I will. I'll put it in the
Have
show
to,
notes just for you. Um,
okay, perfect.
So we have a fun topic today, actually, or maybe it's only fun to me. I actually don't know if other people are going to find this fun. But we're gathered here together for what we're calling the Price is Right edition, because we're going to spend the next half hour or so talking about pricing models, particularly in the context of the broader business model. And I guess that's the first place to start, is that pricing model and business model are not the same thing. And there's a lot of confusion comes out from this, because in the standard pitch deck on the business model slide is where most people put their pricing model. But that's because a lot of the other components of the business model were already covered in previous slides. But the best possible business model slide does not just cover the pricing. So let's start there before we kind of break down into some other details. And those who know me maybe from the Sacramento ecosystem maybe have heard me called the shredder of business models. In the past, that's something that I guess I've been called. But it's one of the names bestowed upon me by those who just don't understand me, I think. But or understand me all too well, one of the two. But it's because I spent a lot of time talking about business models, and the business model concept and framework that I like the best is 4 questions. It's who, what, how, why. And this comes from research. It's often called the magic triangle in business model design, and it's only these four key questions. And if you take any other formulation of the business model, from a business plan to a business model canvas to a lean canvas, to a value map, like anything else that you use to talk about a business model, is some formulation of those 4 components. Like, those 4 components really are all inclusive. They're just big questions. And so they are: who is the customer? That sits at the center. And so you may have been wondering, like, 4 questions and it forms a triangle. How does that work? That's because the customer is in the middle, the center of the triangle. So we have the who is the customer, what is the value created for that customer? That's the value proposition. How is that value created and delivered? So meaning, like, what is the mechanism by which you create the value, like you deliver that value to the customer? And then also, how do you get in front of them? And then fourthly, why does this make money? And that's where you can find the revenue model. But why does this make money is actually a bit more inclusive than even just the, like if you go and ask a founder, like, what's your business model? They'll say, oh, I charge $10 a month. And $10 a month is not a business model. $10 a month isn't even a pricing model. $10 a month is the answer to one single question, which is, how much do you charge? And it does not address the other questions of, not only related to the other 3 points of the business model, but just even to the pricing thing. They don't address who you're charging and how you're charging them. It's just what you're charging them, right? But who and how you're charging are different. So we're going to talk about that, of course. But the why question is even more than that, because it's, why does this make money? Right? Not how do you charge or who do you charge, is why does this make money? So that's not only the financials on the revenue side, it's the financials on the operation side, and it's your ability to scale, right? So if you have a business model where you have 90% margins, like, that's pretty good. Except if you're selling 90% margins and only selling to 100 people, and you're charging $20, like, this is not an interesting business. So why does this make money? It doesn't, even though you have, like, the cost versus revenue is pretty good. Like, so your net profit is pretty good, but it doesn't scale. So that was just a lot of like just context and ground setting to say this is a lot more complicated than you think, even if the price is right. So I'm gonna before we like I'm gonna kind of take this wherever you want, Cameron, because I just talked for a bit about all different kinds of stuff. So where do you want to take the conversation?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add a little more context to kind of the conversation, and then I think let's dive into an example or two. I know you have some resources that might be able to help some founders with particular business models, but maybe we dive into a couple examples into those four questions of who, what, how, and why, and I think that would be a real tangible way to support them. I think my only addition really to some of the context that we're discussing here was it ties back to one of our previous conversations as we look at, building our pitch decks and our presentation to ultimately gain investment, right? We've talked about how that entire creation of a deck is the business model, right? And so that it's fundamentally flawed just to think of that one slide as the business model of like how you make money, because it's ultimately all of the slides that encompass all the evidence and traction that you've gained and demonstrating the answers to those questions. And I think of one of the ways we've shifted that is that like that's your monetization strategy, right? Like that's how you're bringing in revenue into the company, what the price is, how you're charging them, and maybe is there a recurrence to it, and what kind of that high level pattern looks like, but not necessarily encompassing all of the entire business model. And so what we're really trying to help you zoom out is that we often get the question around, well, what should I charge? Well, it's like, well, one, who are you charging? How are you charging them? And what really value are you creating? Right. And that's often
Yeah.
the core question was like, well, if you don't know who you're targeting and what value you're creating, I can't tell you or even come close to help you understand what price to set for your product or service. Right. And so it's going back to some of those foundational elements of who are you targeting, what value are you ultimately creating for them, and then we can get into that nuance of what price. And there's obviously some strategies you can take to ultimately setting that price, but that's only one component. That's not going to necessarily totally break or set you on a pathway to success. And I think the last element I imagine we'll kind of get to, and if we don't, just wanted to make sure as we're thinking of the cost side of the like why this makes money, as you're really building this model, we need to be intentional about like how much does it cost for you to acquire those customers. And so that's often one of the challenges is if you're not specifically targeted on a particular customer or that early adopter, it's hard to calculate like what does that cost to acquire a customer, as you'll hear the acronym of CAC, right, is a way to ultimately set a total cost to like bringing in those customers into your business. And there's, that could be the sales team, that could be all the advertisements, it could be the discounts you provide that then allow them to get in. But we need to understand that element of if you're going to invest into, transitioning from go-to-market to marketing, once you've started to establish this model, understanding that cost is a really key element as you look at the profitability and model as you go forward. So just wanted to add that context. And so, yeah, maybe we dive into, a few examples or ways that we could look at these four questions around some different common business model patterns that we see and dig in from there.
Yeah, I think that that's great. And it's examples are great because the first thing that we've done, like when you start a conversation about business models with founders, like just like I did in my opening and like you just did in yours, is that we're making it inherently more complicated from the outset. It's not as simple as, the question of, oh, how much do I charge? It's like, well, who are you charging? How are you charging? What value are you creating? And like, how is that value creating? How is that getting to them? And like, we're suddenly just creating this really complicated thing. And now it's just like this big overwhelming question, but there's something really cool about it because about not about the complexity itself, but about actually the lack of complexity. It just seems complex. So this is fun. So here's a little history lesson. If we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, and the extraordinary innovations that we've had since then, technological innovations, from, like we're talking about just the steam engine, right? We're talking about computers and technology and electricity, advances in farming. everything from then to the internet to AI, all of the innovations, is such this extraordinary amount of technological impact that's happened in 200 years. And this has all happened largely in the context of capitalism, right? And so and I say that to say in the context of business models, a lot of that's happened in the UK, a lot of that happened in the United States and elsewhere. And so I say all of that to say that like these all happened in the context of business models. And so we might go about thinking about, well, we have these really complex innovations and things like that we're constantly finding new business models. And even amongst all of that innovation over the last 200 years, fully 90% of those innovations, of those groundbreaking revolutionary innovations, did not invent a new business model. 90% of those innovations remixed business models. They had technological innovation, but not business model innovation. And that's because business models tend to follow patterns. So here's one example from one pattern, and then we can kind of abstract this a little bit wider. So one example is we have actually, I'll break with convention here and go a little earlier. So Standard & Poor's, we may think about them differently today, but Standard & Poor's sold lamps. In the 1870s, they sold lamps. And so it was a heating lamp, right? A lamp used for light and heating. And so you buy the lamp and then you would buy the oil. And the same company, Standard & Poor's, sold both. They sold the lamp and they sold the oil. And so they would make money off of the initial sale of the lamp, not a huge amount, right? Like they weren't making a killing at the lamp, and a lot of other people sold lamps. But you'd have to buy the oil ongoing, and so they'd make like recurring revenue, if you will, on the sales of the oil. Fast forward 30 years, beginning of the 20th century, and we have Gillette. I always botch his name. His name's King Gillette, and he had what he did for his company. And there was another competitor who actually did the same thing. So part of the story is apocryphal, but we always attribute it to Gillette. So we'll just kind of go with that. But what they said is like, instead of just a standard straight razor that you buy and shave with, and you go get sharpened and do all that, you're selling somebody one razor that's going to last them a lifetime, or at least last them a really long time. He said, let's sell them the razor unit itself. And then let's have disposable blades. Instead of going and getting these blades sharpened, you just toss the blade away, get a new blade. It's convenient. And now you sell the upfront razor, and then you make money on the blades ongoing, which is why this became known as the razors and blades model. And the razors and blades did not invent it. That's just what we call it now. So now you have this razors and blades model. So that was used again in the future. So let's fast forward, a few decades into the future, and we have inkjet printers. So when inkjet printers came around, you had to buy the printer, and then you bought the ink. And so for those of you listening that are old enough to remember like buying printers in the 90s and like early 2000s and stuff like that, you would get these like ridiculously cheap printers, or you get a free printer with your computer or something like that. And the reason they would do that is because they could afford to lose money on the printer itself, because they were making so much money on the inkjet cartridges that they sold afterward, razors and blades. Then the iPod comes out. What was revolutionary about the iPod was not that it was an MP3 player. They were not the first, second, or even third MP3 player. And as an MP3 player, they weren't particularly special in that regard. What they did that was fundamentally different and fundamentally interesting was that they created an ecosystem around the device itself by having a store that they called iTunes at the time. Right. And so iTunes was where you could go and buy these MP3s. You could plug it into your computer, and they would transfer on to the MP3 player all in one. You didn't have to go about the process of procuring the songs elsewhere to put on your device. Razors and blades, they sold you the device, they sold you the songs, right, over time. So they weren't just making money on the upfront device. Kindles work the same way. Cell phones and app stores work the same way, right? Video game systems work this way now. All of that is razors and blades. So we have this like whole series of completely different innovations over the course of 150 years, all using this exact same business model pattern that we call razors and blades. I was just pausing there because that was a long
history lesson myself. Yeah, so it wasn't. It was interesting nonetheless. So I was taking it all in, and I do love history, so I appreciate the progression of the way the business model not has changed, but it's been utilized in different ways, and
Mhm.
that pattern continues to exist. I think the like 2 points I would add, just one, appreciate the kind of history lesson in relation to it for sure, was the oftentimes we think of like the innovation being like, oh, I'm totally going to disrupt the industry. And they often sometimes, we use the Airbnbs and things, for example, and, that was a little bit of a different business model to a degree. But one of the things that we would look at though is it wasn't necessarily, it was a different type of value that was ultimately being created. And that, as you're coming in, you don't have to necessarily as customers to a degree, we're understanding of these different models. And so it's just being clear about what value you're bringing into the market in relation to this new pattern that maybe they're using for your particular solution, whatever that solution might be. And so the example that came to mind, I think I showed you a picture of this the other day, was the iPod, right? And oftentimes we see founders really positioning their solutions with the feature set, right, and not the value. And so the example, if you remember, JDM, that I showed you was like
Mhm.
a
Yeah.
picture of a iPod, and under it said, 5 gigabytes of data versus 1,000 songs in your pocket, right? And what sold people was not the 5 gigabytes of data, right? It was those 1,000 songs in your pocket, which was the core value that they're selling. But that also ties into that business model of, once you buy this, you're going to buy the songs. So it's like, in order for you to utilize the data, you're going to have to buy 99-cent songs as you go forward, right? And so it's being clear about the value that you're providing amongst that whole generation of what you're trying to create and bring into fruition.
I just love that like feature versus benefit thing. And there's you can find all kinds of examples of it. I think that's by far the most popular one because it's so incredibly stark, right? Like, who cares that you have like, what does 5 gigabytes of storage even mean? Like, nobody cares, right? What they care about is that they're walking around with 1,000 songs. It's like a feature benefit thing. And so I've noticed a lot of founders struggle with that transition. That's probably a whole other episode of the pod to like talk about. I think features versus benefits would be a really interesting episode because it can be really hard to go
Yeah.
from features to benefits, which is usually, if I'm being honest, a sign that the process went backward, right? That it didn't start with what value can I create for customers? Like, what problems can I solve for them? It started with, I think it would be cool if, and that's not wrong, but that's why, like, anyway, but back to business models. So
Well,
that
I
was
think,
it.
I mean, yeah, well, I think where that ties to business models though is like, it's obvious that part of that is not clear on who you're targeting and what they're getting out of it, right? And so as
Right,
you're
right.
thinking of like the missing part of that like triangle was like, who's your customer? Well, like if you don't have that, the triangle starts to fold in on itself to a degree, or maybe it is a weaker triangle because you don't know who you're targeting, and then obviously what value you're creating if you don't know. So yeah, you might be able to set a price to the feature set because you understand the cost to building it, but you don't know what value you're generating because you don't know who you're selling it to. And so you have to have answers to all of those foundational questions to start.
Yeah, I think, yeah,
Sorry
that's
if I,
really great. No, 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 that was perfect because it tied right back into this idea of, the business model isn't just about the price, right? And so that those speak specifically to who you're, who and what is the value you're creating and delivering, right? And so like that, that was really great, and I appreciate you tying that back. So I mentioned this idea of patterns. Like, I don't think it may be interesting, but not super helpful until we finish that thought, which is that was one pattern. There are 54 others, and that's it. That's it. There are 55 business model patterns, which mean, and they're in a list that you can get. I'll put it in the show notes, right? Like these 55 business model patterns are well known, well understood, with examples for all of them, or almost all of them, probably that you are personally familiar with. You see these all the time, which means that when you're going through the process of trying to figure out what business model makes sense for you, you would be like hugely remiss if you did not go through the list and say which business models, plural, make the most sense within the context of the problem that you're trying to solve in the industry that you're trying to solve it with, in the way that you're trying to solve it. So let's maybe just do a couple much quicker examples on razors and blades. So that you can get an idea of this. Now, So these are patterns, and these patterns affect different parts of that business model. So they affect the who, they affect the what, they affect the how, they affect the why. They don't all affect all of them. They usually only affect a couple of them. But as you can figure, if you tweak the value proposition, it's probably tweaking the customer, right? Because that a different value proposition might appeal to a slightly different customer. If you change the price, that could impact the customer as well. So these are all like inherently connected together. But the business model pattern itself is specifically linked to, 2, 3 parts of the triangle. So here's a couple examples. So let's start with ones that are kind of super straightforward, and then maybe get into ones that aren't. So auction, that's a pattern. Think eBay, right? eBay did not invent the auction pattern, obviously, but eBay brought it to a particular space. But there's like other ways that showed up too. The original, I don't know if they are anymore, but the original Priceline, for example, remember the place where you'd go, I think William Shatner used to do the commercials for like Priceline back in the day, right, where you get cheap hotels and stuff like that. That was an auction-based system as well that used auction as a business model. So that's one. Here's another one, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is a business model, and that can work for the launch itself, think Kickstarter or GoFundMe or something like that, or it can work across the entire life cycle of the business. So that's another one. Let's talk about something completely different. I'm literally going through the list. I'm going to put in the show notes here. I'm looking for ones that are super easy to understand. Okay, so here's a couple. Pay per use. Right? So instead of saying, I'm going to charge you $10 per month, you're going to pay me each time you use it. Right? Another one is like more usage. You can pay for the usage itself, which is a variation of the same business model. Think of Amazon Web Services or almost any other cloud computing provider, where you're paying for how much of the resources you use. You don't pay a flat monthly fee. You pay $0 a month unless you use resources. Then you pay only for the resources used, right? So pay per use. Another one is pay what you want. Right. So these are the like name your own price thing. Those are really popular, and some businesses have done like phenomenally good business for based on those kinds of things. We already talked about razors and blades. That's one of them as well. Self-service is one. So think about self-service versus the alternative, which would be, say, something like a concierge, right? So self-service is like you want to use Monday.com or something like that. You go to Monday.com and you sign up for a Monday.com account. They don't sponsor the show, so I should stop repeating their name unless you want to sponsor the show Monday. But you go on and you sign up for your own account, and you're there and you're in and you do it, and that's very different than talking to a travel agent who is booking all of the travel and stuff like that for you, to use a completely different example. Right? So those are part of the business model too, even though those don't directly relate to pricing. But there's also things that are maybe a little bit less obvious. And I'll just give one example of that. And this one is called Aikido, after the Japanese martial art. So Aikido, the premise of the martial art is using your opponent's weight against them, right? So like if somebody's coming in for a really powerful punch, there's a lot of like inertia behind their body movement. And so you position yourself in a way to use that, their inertia against them to, for example, flip them over and cause them to, be prone on the ground. And the business model Aikido works exactly the same way. And it's doing something that's diametrically opposed to whatever the competition is already doing. And I think a really good example of that is Nintendo. So in 2006, I think, when Nintendo came out with the Wii, which is, it's pretty dated now, but they've continued with the same model through today. But when the Wii came out, they did something that was very different than PlayStation, that was very different from Xbox. And what Xbox and PlayStation were doing, they were in this deadlocked competition for the best graphics. Like, how do we do this with like really sophisticated, really realistic, by 2006 standards, graphics? And so you had in order to do that, you had extraordinary processing power, right? So the units themselves, the PlayStations and the Xboxes, got really, really expensive because they had to have enormous processing power on there. And then of course, you had to buy the game separately from that. Nintendo said, let's do something completely different. Let's not do high-end, like really sophisticated graphics games. They did retro games. And so some of them were literally the retro games from the older Nintendo systems, but others were just like, if you remember, or if you've ever played on a Wii, the graphics were never impressive, and they were never supposed to be. It was intentionally designed to be a little pixely, a little bit kitschy, a little bit less than. And that was to be in opposition to that, which meant that you could sell the Wii at a considerably lower price and then make money on the games, right? So there's a razors and blades component to that as well, which ties back to all of that. So it's positioning yourself against the competition. So instead of saying like, they're in that race to the top for graphics, we're not going to do that. We're instead going to take this in a completely different direction. And they also changed the way that motion capture like worked. Instead of using a controller, there was also, you would use hand motions. So that was Aikido kind of is part of that as well. Oh, but anyway, so like that's just part of the value proposition, right? Is just tweaking the value proposition for that as well as the customer along the way. And then how the value chain, of course, changes with that too, because now you're doing a less expensive unit and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there, but there's an example of like patterns that you can use.
I love it. Well, thanks for diving into the ones that are a little more common and a couple of the unique ones. And just to add on to the Nintendo example, that's been a example used in kind of blue ocean strategy. And I think a core shift in that business model was who they were targeting, right? So again, it's going back to that core function was they weren't targeting the same people that wanted to play Halo and Call of Duty. They were targeting people that would be interested in playing games, but they didn't need all of those other things. They wanted a way, maybe the value was different that they were hoping to get out of it, right? And so a core shift that they made was the who, and that they realized that this audience didn't care as much about having the high-end graphics. They just wanted accessible games that could be played with friends, and the value that ultimately was different, and therefore they could, build a different solution, and therefore a lower cost type of solution that kind of allowed them to enter into the market and ultimately grow and scale within that particular space. One of the ones that I often see that kind of always stands out to me is the leveraged customer data component of it, right? And so I see this a lot when we see business, startups that are targeting a customer and a user, right? And we were actually chatting about the chicken and egg challenge before we hopped on our call here today. But that's really when you're leveraging customer data, that's kind of one of the core elements of like, in order for you to be able to generate enough data to ultimately sell, whether that's for advertising or whatever that might be, who is actually your customer, you have to have that user base. And it kind of is this, often chicken and egg, but you have to be able to define that value to both. And so, obviously platform types of businesses are ones that struggle with this particular challenge because you have two different who's and you have two, triangles of success, or what I don't know exactly what or maybe it's a magic triangle that you call it for the business model. And so there's some of these that are, yes, a little more complicated, but they're still rooted in the same thinking. And even though your customer is maybe, or your user might not be paying you, you have to be intentional about what are you capturing from them that you then can charge on the other side. So if they're not engaging in your solution in a way that creates any, what we call a derivative asset that you're then able to sell to who you think your customer is, then it's not really worth anything from that user engaging on the platform. And so you have to be intentional on what they're ultimately engaging in, what asset in terms of data they're leaving for you to be able to sell on the other side. So that was just one that I wanted to share, because I think we often see a lot of platforms come across and they, have a challenge in that, but you have to be intentional about, you have two different who's that need different value, and you need to ultimately mirror or connect to that value across those two.
Yeah. And I think like the benefit of patterns is that they force you to think about the right question, right? So for example, in that example, right, where we're saying, okay, we know we're going to have a two-sided market. Like we can't think if you're a Google in the 90s, it's like, well, we can't charge people to search the internet. Like that's not going to work, right? Like the economics of that just don't pan out. And so then it's like, okay, so we know we're going to have another player. So now you have a two-sided market that forces you to ask the question, like, what value can we create for the other side of the market? You already know the value you're creating for the people searching the internet, right? Well, what's the value for the other side of the market? It's knowing what people are searching for. And it's being able to put offers in front of people at the moment that they're looking for that very thing or something close to that very thing, right? That's the value you can deliver to this completely different group of people, the people who want to be found, right? And so people searching versus people who want to be found. And so like that's the benefit of patterns. And so like the idea of business model innovation, which is what we call this if you're doing this in like in an enterprise, which I don't do that much anymore, but because I spend my time mostly with startups these days. But that business model innovation side is where like you literally just ask the question, what would it look like if, right? If we were to take a two-sided market and plug that into what we're working on now, what would that look like? And there are 55 patterns and you can go through all 55 and they're not mutually exclusive, right? Obviously some of these like, as we even had some examples are going to use more than one. Most businesses use 2 or 3 of these, even for a single product line. And so you can go through, literally just go through the list and say, what would it look like if, and form a whole series of hypotheses. And you might say it's 55 hypotheses because there are 55 business models, but that's not true. Like if you take even the two-sided market one, that like you can come up with multiple different customers and multiple different ways to look at that. So some of these will give you multiple hypotheses. And then you can say, all right, which ones of these make literally no sense at all? And most of them probably fall into that category. And then there's some of them that are like, I don't know if this makes sense or yet not. My gut says no. And so we're going to look at it a little bit further. And then you have the ones that are probably when you go through, you're going to go, huh, that's interesting. Right. And then and obviously you can spend some time, investigating those as well. And that's when you go through the process that we've talked about a million times of like you got to do the cycles at that point. But the patterns focus you into the right question to ask. And that's the hard part. And so when people are thinking like with founders, when you're thinking about business models, or you think about how do you make money at this thing and how do you make this really compelling as a business, think about it in terms of what are the patterns that we can apply to solve this particular problem that are going to turn this into a lucrative opportunity. Go through the list.
I love it. I'll just share one last thing and then turn it over to you to kind of get us to wrap here. But I think, in going through this kind of these 55 business model patterns, I think one of the key elements that this could support you as a founder is it'll give you that language to articulate something that has common language built around it. And so as you're building your decks and communicating with advisors, coaches, investors, right, you can use these common patterns in your pitch decks, right? Or in your, I'm thinking of your monetization, right? You could say, hey, well, we're using these 3 different patterns. Here's what they are. And now you're pulling the language, and they even have great examples of other businesses that use them. So you're able to articulate that in a way. And so you're reducing the risk because you're able to articulate the core foundations of where you're pulling these patterns versus, I'm just charging this price and, ultimately it's going to be a subscription. It's rooted in some of that example, and you can ultimately be able to articulate those different patterns going forward. But we hope you use the resource and start thinking of the different patterns. And again, it's answering those 4 questions. It's not just, is this price the right price to be charging? It's all about the who, what, how, and why.
I think that's a great place to call it here. We're at our time. We're running out of time here. So thank you everyone for joining us here. But we cannot close out an episode of Zero to Traction without some frivolity. We've dived deep into business models, and now we're gonna surface back up a little bit for some frivolity. So Cameron, why don't you kick us off? What you got?
Sure. Yeah. So mine, as I maybe have shared in a past episode, I've been training for CIM, the California International Marathon. So I've been hitting a lot of time out on the American River Parkway. But one of my frivolous thought is I'm a big proponent of while I'm running, I give the, hey, like I will wave and, for, I got to my longest run, which has been 18 miles. And you see a lot of people, and it's surprising the amount of people who don't wave back or acknowledge that you just, wave to them. And so that's been kind of, it keeps me busy on my runs of like, oh, like, did that person not see me? Or, is that, what does that mean about them? Or why do I feel like I have to say hi, right? And so it keeps me busy for, multiple times. But so if you are a runner and you are a waver, hey, you're my friend. Those that don't acknowledge, just curious why. But I do have these really cool socks. They have like the kind of like as you would run the like, hey, all right, sign, like a little peace sign on my sock. So, but that was my frivolous thought. That's been on my mind of as I've been hitting miles. So.
Well, congrats on the progress there. That's impressive. I can get nowhere near 18 miles. So that's good. Also, I'm now wondering which category of person I fall into, when I'm out and about.
Yes.
I usually have the like podcast earbuds in. So
That's all
best
right.
we don't, yeah,
That's
best
all
we
right. And
don't,
maybe you're probably a heads down guy. It's okay. It's cool.
as you know, all right. I just, have to keep an eye on that. But that aside, this is my object lesson is gonna be simple. We are we're recording this on Monday. You're probably either watching us on Monday or listening to us on Tuesday. And if either one of those things are true, then that means that tomorrow or today is election day. And we're not a political show. I'm not going to take any political stance on this show. That's not what we're here for. Everybody is welcome under the zero detraction tent, and everybody's welcome in entrepreneurship. So I'm not going to take any stance on that, but I am going to say just the following, which is somebody once said, decisions are made by those who show up, and I hope you show up and vote. So that's it. That's all I'm going to say.
Here.
Go vote. And with that, that brings us to
there.
the end of the.
I've already tapped.
You what? You've already cast your vote. All right, yeah, yeah.
I said I already got there. I didn't wear my, I haven't worn my sticker yet.
Yeah, I feel like there's a fun book. It's a good read. It came out 12, 15 years ago, something like that. It's by Jason Brennan, who's a professor of ethics at I'm forgetting. It doesn't matter. George Mason, I think. And anyway, one of the things that he studies is democracy and voting and all that. And I found the book very, very interesting for a number of reasons. I'm not going to endorse it or anything here for no other reason. It's been too long since I read it. But he opens with this anecdote. And the book, by the way, is called Against Democracy. He opens with this anecdote about how on election day everybody's walking around with the I voted stickers, and he said, the average person, they walk around, they see somebody with an I voted sticker, and they say, good for you. And he says, when I walk around and I see somebody with an I voted sticker, I think, shame on you. And the reason for that is the premise of the book is that most people shouldn't vote, shouldn't be allowed to vote. The book does not advocate for any kind of restrictions on voting, but he said most people have an ethical or moral duty to stay home on election day. Anyway, very interesting perspective. If that's your bag. Anyway, the voting sticker reminded me. Bonus object lesson.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to wrap it there because, well, Beth just gave two competing arguments. I think both is part of my lesson. So I will round back to the first one and say decisions are made by those who show up. Go. Okay, and that's all the time we have. So thank you, Cameron, for hanging out with me today, as always, and thank you everybody for listening. In the same vein as my frivolity here, podcasts grow by word of mouth. They grow by your actions, and so I hope you'll help us get into the hands of more entrepreneurs who are looking to create companies that scale. Like, follow, subscribe, leave a review. Or just tell a friend about it. We really do appreciate it. Always humbled when I see those things come through. So very, very flattering. Please take a moment to do that. We'll be back in your podcast feeds next week. And then the week after next, we'll be in Global Entrepreneurship Week. So as I teased at the top, we will be recording in person at the Carlsen Center live. We'll put the links to that in the show notes, but basically you can just come. Cameron and I are going to be on stage recording an episode, and it'll be live Q&A. So you can come be on the podcast. You can be one of our co-hosts for the week. It'll be super fun. We'll talk about that more next week, because that's in 2 weeks, which is Wednesday the 20th. Is when we'll be recording that as part of Global Entrepreneurship Week. I'm sure we'll talk about Global Entrepreneurship Week next week, because that's a big, meaty topic. So just to tease that. And with that, Cameron, thanks again for hanging out with me.
Thank you. My pleasure. We'll see you all next time. So.
All right. Thanks and take it easy. See you next week.